Clara Navarro found the eviction notice on a Tuesday, folded under her apartment doors sometime after midnight. The building super had left it without knocking, which was either cowardice or consideration depending on how you looked at it. She was already awake, standing at the kitchen sink in the dark, washing the dinner dishes she'd left soaking because after Leo's homework and the bath that became a 40-minute negotiation and the 2 bedtime stories that turned into 4, the dishes had felt like one task too many. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. She dried her hands and read the notice under the kitchen light. Then she sat down at the table and read it twice more. 14 days. $2,340 in back rent, or vacate the premises. Clara turned the notice face down and did the math she'd been doing every month for the past several months. The math that never came out right. Her check from the dental office where she worked as an administrative assistant came to $1,400 a month after taxes. The grocery store on weekends added another $400, sometimes $350 when her manager cut her hours on short notice, which he did whenever his own numbers looked tight. Together, when both checks cleared and nothing went sideways, she brought home somewhere between $1,600 and $1,700 a month. Rent was $1,200. That left $400, sometimes $500, for everything else. Leo's food, his school supplies, the electricity bill, the gas in her car, the car insurance she dropped to the legal minimum 2 months ago, the copay for the ear infection in September that the school nurse caught before Clara did, the replacement boots Leo had needed in October when his old ones split at the seam in the first real rain. She'd been falling behind on rent by increments. $50 short 1 month when the car needed a tire. $80 another month when Leo's winter boots wore through before she'd budgeted for new ones. $200 the month Marco stopped sending child support at all. The debt had accumulated the way small failures do, below the threshold of alarm until it was suddenly very large. In her bedroom, in the fireproof lockbox she'd bought at a hardware store the week after her mother's funeral, Clara kept an envelope containing $8,850. Her mother's life insurance payout. She'd been protecting that money for 14 months, refusing to touch it for anything she thought she could find another way to handle, telling herself it was for Leo's education, for a genuine emergency, for something that deserved it. She had been making smaller emergencies out of things that probably qualified and choosing instead to struggle. She couldn't sleep. She opened her laptop on the kitchen table and sat in the glow of the screen and did what people do when they can't sleep and don't want to think. She scrolled. Job listings she wasn't qualified for. Apartment rental pages that made her chest tighten. A forum she'd bookmarked months earlier for single parents in financial hardship, the kind of place where strangers offered small pieces of advice and larger amounts of solidarity. Then she clicked, almost without intending to, on another bookmarked page she hadn't revisited since she'd saved it, the Kellerton County property auction listings. She'd found it during a search about affordable housing options and had set it aside with the vague intention of looking at it properly someday. It loaded. She scrolled without purpose, without expectation, the kind of late-night browsing that has no goal except to give the hand something to do. The listing was 47th on the page. The thumbnail photograph was small and taken from a distance too great to show much detail. But she knew that building the way you know your own kitchen in the dark, by shape and proportion and the quality of the light it held at particular hours. The Ashworth Grand Hotel, Kellerton, Oregon. Minimum bid, $5,000. Auction date, Friday. Friday was 3 days away. Clara put her elbows on the table and her face in her hands and stayed that way for a long time. The Ashworth Grand had been the best hotel in Kellerton for most of the 80 years it had existed. Not famous in the way that destination properties get famous, not the kind of place that appeared in travel publications or competed for national recognition. It was smaller than that and more specific. A local institution, a mid-sized Oregon city's finest option, the place where families came for holiday dinners and couples went for anniversaries and where business visitors stayed because there was simply nothing better in town. 7 floors, 64 guest rooms, a ballroom on the 2nd floor that had hosted 5 decades of weddings and charity galas and annual fundraisers for the county hospital. A kitchen that sourced from within 30 miles of the building, which had been a philosophy long before it became a marketing strategy. A lobby with a pressed tin ceiling that had been photographed exactly once for a regional architecture journal in 1972, and then left in peace to be exactly what it was. Clara's mother, Rosa Navarro, had worked in that hotel for 36 years. Rosa had come to Kellerton from Oaxaca in 1979, for years before Clara was born, on a work visa and enough English to navigate a bus schedule. She'd found the job at the Ashworth Grand through a reference from a woman at her church who'd worked in hospitality for 2 decades, who told the hotel's general manager that Rosa Navarro was the kind of person who understood the difference between a room that appeared clean and a room that actually was. Rosa had proven this accurate every working day for the next 3.5 decades. She'd started as a room attendant and worked her way, over 22 years, to head housekeeper, a title she treated with a seriousness that made it feel like something more than what titles usually are. Rosa was not a woman who spoke about herself. She was not a woman who explained the standards she held or the reasons she held them. She showed up every scheduled day, and many days she wasn't scheduled, and she did her work at a level she applied to herself the way a craftsman applies a standard to something meant to outlast the person who made it. The rooms she oversaw were not clean in the way that hospitality properties use that word as a synonym for presentable. They were genuinely clean. Staff who worked under her understood the difference inside their first week, and the ones who couldn't reach the standard found themselves reassigned to floors she didn't oversee. Clara had spent a large part of her childhood inside that building. When school let out before Rosa's shift ended, Rosa brought her daughter to work rather than leave her with anyone else. Clara had learned the back corridors of the Ashworth Grand before she'd learned to ride a bicycle. The staff passages that smelled of clean linen and industrial cleaner. The service elevator that groaned differently depending on how much it was carrying. The supply closets where the particular arrangement of cleaning materials reflected Rosa's system and no one else's. She'd polished silverware in the prep kitchen alongside dishwashers who treated her like a mascot. She'd folded napkins into swan shapes the banquet team taught her. She'd done her homework at the end of her mother's cart, rocked gently by the motion of Rosa moving from room to room through the afternoon floors, and she'd understood very early that work done at that level, consistently and without announcement, was its own kind of argument for the person doing it. She knew which third-floor window stuck in cold weather because the latch had been repaired improperly in 1991 and nobody had bothered to fix it right. She knew the ballroom chandelier had 47 crystal drops on its outer ring, because she'd counted them when she was 6 and then counted them again at 8 to verify the first count. She knew the smell of the linen closet on the 4th floor, cedar, and something faintly floral that had been exactly the same for as long as she could remember. She knew the way afternoon light came through the west-facing windows in winter, cutting low and amber across the corridor floors. She knew that the kitchen staff put on a radio on Saturday mornings that you could hear faintly from the service elevator, and she knew that the head chef from 1987 through 2004 had a habit of humming the same 4 bars of the same song while he worked the line, a fragment that was either a hymn or a folk song from somewhere she never identified. These were not the kinds of things you could know about a place you'd only visited. They were the kinds of things you knew about a place that had been part of your formation. The Ashworth had been owned by the Ashworth family for 60 years. In 2003, when the family finally ran out of heirs willing to manage it, they sold to a corporation called Meridian Properties, which had plans for a luxury renovation, gutting the interior, nearly doubling the room count, rebranding the property as a boutique destination for the growing Pacific Northwest tourism market. The renovation had started. It had stripped the hotel of significant portions of its original character, pulled the carpets from the lower floor corridors, gutted several guest rooms down to the framing, demolished the original reception desk that Rosa had always considered one of the most beautiful pieces of furniture she'd ever seen in a working building. Then Meridian's financing collapsed in 2009. The renovation had stalled in place, neither complete nor reversible. The hotel had limped along for another decade under the bank's oversight, running at diminished capacity, never recovering the standard that had made it worth staying in. The bank foreclosed formally in 2019, began the long process of preparing the property for sale, and in the middle of that process the county had seized it for 3 years of unpaid property taxes. Legal resolution had moved slowly. It had produced nothing except the auction listing now open on Clara's laptop. Rosa had watched the hotel's decline with the grief of someone who cannot say directly what is being lost, because saying it directly would require admitting how much it cost. Clara could read it in the way her mother's voice went flat when the Ashworth Grand came up in conversation. A closing over. The specific stillness of someone being careful not to show how much something is taking from them. Rosa retired in 2017, 2 years before the foreclosure. By then the building had become something she no longer fully recognized. 36 years of showing up had made it hers in a way that belonged entirely to the person who does the work and to no one else. And watching it become something else had been its own kind of loss. One she never put into words because words would have required her to look at it directly. Clara's own life had taken a different shape from the one she'd intended for it. She'd studied hotel management for 2 years at the community college, drawn by something she couldn't entirely explain except that she'd grown up watching her mother make a building better by being in it, and that had seemed like a thing worth pursuing. She dropped out when her mother's health problems became serious enough to require her attention, and she'd moved into office administration because the hours were steadier and the hotel management program hadn't survived the college's next round of budget cuts anyway. She'd worked front desk at a smaller hotel for 3 years, then moved into general administrative work when Leo was born, and she needed something that didn't require weekends and evenings. She was 33 years old. She worked 5 mornings a week at a dental office and 2 weekend days at a grocery store, and she was still falling behind on rent, and she had a son who was 8 years old and deserved better than the math she was doing at 1 in the morning. Marco had left 19 months ago. Not dramatically. A note on the kitchen table, the kind long enough to suggest he'd thought about what to say, but short enough to make clear he'd decided before he started writing. He'd paid child support for 6 months, reliably and on time, and then the payments had stopped. When she called, the number went to a voicemail that wasn't his. When she contacted his family, they were polite and evasive, the manner of people who know something they've decided isn't theirs to share. She'd filed with the county for enforcement. She was still waiting. Rosa died 14 months ago. A stroke, rapid and total, in the parking lot of the grocery store she shopped at every Saturday morning. A passing stranger had called 911. By the time Clara reached the hospital, there was nothing left to decide except the paperwork. Her mother was 58 years old. She had appeared healthy. The stroke had given no warning worth catching. Clara inherited the contents of Rosa's apartment and the life insurance payout of $9,400. She'd put the money in the lockbox and gone back to working and raising Leo and doing the math that never came out right, and she'd told herself month after month that the money was for something worth it. She'd found the letter 3 weeks after the funeral, going through her mother's belongings with the methodical numbness that acute grief sometimes produces. It was in a small wooden box on the dresser, among photographs and the objects a life accumulates in its deeper drawers. A St. Christopher medal worn smooth at the edges, a birthday card from Clara dated 1991 with a child's drawing of a flower that still looked more or less like one, a receipt from a repair shop for a watch Rosa had owned since she came to this country. The letter was written on Ashworth Grand stationery, the old kind from before Meridian changed the letterhead. The date was March of 2019, for months before the bank's foreclosure. The handwriting was careful and small, the kind that comes from someone for whom writing has always been a deliberate act. It was addressed to Rosa. It thanked her, at length and with a specificity that felt deeply personal, in the manner of someone who had thought carefully about what they wanted to say and concluded that a shorter version would be inadequate. It thanked her for 22 years of consideration for his particular requirements, for the meals left outside his door on the days he hadn't been able to leave his room, for the way she'd maintained his privacy as a private matter rather than hotel knowledge, for understanding without being told that he valued his solitude more than he valued being asked how his day was going. There were 3 paragraphs in the letter, and each of them covered a different year and a different specific kindness, the kind of specific that could only come from someone who had been paying close attention to the accumulation of a long relationship. It mentioned Clara twice, by name. Your Clara, who used to sit at the end of your cart and watch everything with those serious eyes, the one who I think will amount to something considerable, given time. The letter was signed simply, Elias. She'd looked him up. Elias Vance. The online record was sparse and aging, the kind of digital presence left by someone who had spent years making it as small as possible. a private antiquities dealer who had operated primarily in Europe and Asia through the 1970s and 80s. A brief mention in a 2003 Kellerton newspaper article about the Ashworth Grand sale to Meridian, noting that the hotel's only remaining long-term resident, a private collector who had occupied room 318 since 1989, had agreed to remain in place during the transition. After that, nothing public. No social media, no interviews, no conference appearances, no professional listings. The kind of absence that takes effort. Clara remembered him in fragments. A thin man who walked the third-floor corridor at hours that bore no obvious relationship to conventional schedules, always in the same corduroy jacket regardless of the weather. He had a formal courtesy that felt old-fashioned even to an 8-year-old, the kind of manners that assume the other person has been taught the same once. He'd once pressed a small carved wooden fish into her hand without explanation as he passed her in the hall. He'd said simply, "I made this when I was your age," and walked on. She'd kept it, though she hadn't thought about it in years. She'd filed the letter with her mother's other papers and returned to the business of surviving. She'd thought about it occasionally, the way you think about something that doesn't have an obvious place to fit, that sits in the back of a drawer in your mind with no label and no urgency. Now she was at a kitchen table at 1:30 in the morning looking at an auction listing for a building she'd grown up in, a building where a man who'd once written a letter about her had lived in one room for 30 years and then been removed when the bank took everything over, a building whose sealed third floor held whatever Elias Vance had left behind when they finally made him go. She closed the laptop, went to bed, lay in the dark and thought about her mother's face in the last year before retirement, watching. Something she'd given her working life to become unrecognizable. In the morning she called Diana. Diana was her older sister by 2 years, steady in a way Clara had always admired and occasionally found like a wall. She worked in hospital administration, owned a house, had a long-term partner, and held opinions about risk that came from a life built carefully on avoided regret. Clara called from the parking lot of the dental office 10 minutes before her shift because she'd learned over the years that difficult conversations with Diana went better when Clara had a hard stop she could point to. The response was immediate and not particularly gentle. "You want to buy the Ashworth Grand? With Mama's life insurance money. I want to bid on it. The minimum is $5,000. Clara. Each syllable had weight behind it. That building has been vacant for 4 years. The roof is compromised. There's foundation water intrusion at the north wall. Do you know what it costs to bring a commercial property up to code? We are talking hundreds of thousands of dollars before you ever open a door to a paying guest. You don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars. You have Leo. I know I have Leo. Then act like it. Take the back rent out of the insurance money, get yourself stable, and figure out the next move from solid ground. Don't spend what Mama left on a broken building because you have feelings about it. I grew up in that building. When you were little, it's not the same building anymore. The bones are the same. I've been inside it 6 times this week doing my own assessment. The roofing issue is confined to 2 rooms on the 6th floor. The foundation problem is smaller than the county's report implies. I know what needs doing. You were an administrator, Clara, not a contractor, not a commercial real estate developer. I know how to read a structural survey. I've been reading them all week. If I acquire the property for $5,000 and sell it within 2 years, even at a steep discount from assessed value, I come out ahead of where I am right now. You come out ahead if nothing goes wrong. If the building doesn't have problems your 6 visits missed. If you can afford to carry 2 years of taxes and maintenance costs. If a buyer materializes at the end of it. That's a considerable number of things that all have to go right simultaneously. Everything is a lot of if right now. Let me loan you the back rent. Diana's voice softened by a degree. I can do that. You don't need to gamble your mother's savings to solve a problem that has a simpler answer. I'm not taking your money. You'd rather bet the only cushion you have than accept help from your sister. The conversation did not end with agreement. Clara went into the dental office and filed things and answered calls and thought about the auction listing for most of the afternoon, turning it over in her mind from different angles the way you turn a problem over when you already know what you're going to do but aren't ready to admit it. She told Terri that evening. They talked on the phone while Leo worked on his homework at the kitchen table, or attempted to, going in and out of focus the way he did when the day had been long enough. Terri had been her closest friend for 12 years. The kind of friendship built on proximity and the specific loyalty that comes from watching each other get through things. She worked in retail management and had a practical intelligence Clara trusted on most matters. Terri was quiet for a moment after Clara explained. Then, is there something specific you think is in that building? Or is this more of a feeling? Both, probably. Okay, so you're going to bid on a commercial hotel that needs serious repair money because your mother worked there for 36 years and you have a feeling about it. When you say it that way, I'm saying it the way it is. Clara, I love you. But you have $8,000 and a kid and you're 14 days from eviction. You can't afford feelings right now. You can afford to get through the next 90 days without losing your apartment. I know. So let Diana help with the rent, or let me help, and pay us back when you're on steadier ground. That's what people do when they're in trouble. They ask. Clara looked at Leo. He'd put his face down on his math worksheet and gone still in the way he sometimes did near the end of a long day, just going absent at the table without ceremony, his pencil still in his hand and the eraser leaving a faint mark on his cheek. She thanked Terri, said she'd think about it, meant neither part with any particular conviction. She went to the auction on Friday morning alone. She told Diana she had a medical appointment. She dropped Leo at the neighbor's apartment, where he had standing permission on weekend mornings, and she drove to the county office building in the gray of 9 in the morning with the lockbox on the passenger seat and the auction listing folded in her jacket pocket and both hands steady on the wheel. The drive took 22 minutes. She didn't turn on the radio. She rehearsed the argument for what she was about to do and found that the argument felt thin stated out loud, and she did it anyway, which was its own kind of answer to the question she'd been asking herself for 3 days. The room was small and bureaucratic. Fluorescent light overhead, metal folding chairs, the faint smell of burnt coffee, and a cleaning product that hadn't quite done its job on the floor. 3 other people were there when she arrived. A man in a fleece vest with a development company lanyard clipped to his collar, scrolling his phone with one hand and holding a coffee in the other, radiating the comfortable certainty of someone who bid on properties the way other people bought groceries. A couple in their 50s who had the organized, prepared energy of people who'd come about a specific property and knew exactly what they wanted. And the county employee at the front table who had the practiced neutrality of someone who processed outcomes for a living and had long since stopped attaching any particular meaning to the results. The Ashworth Grand was the second property on the list. When the county employee read the building's condition report, a 2-minute summary covering the compromised roofing on the 5th and 6th floors, the ground-level water intrusion at the north foundation wall, and the electrical systems last inspected in 2017, the developer in the fleece vest opened a small notebook, wrote something, and closed it again. He didn't bid. He'd done his math before he came in, and the condition report had given him a number he didn't like. The county employee looked at the room. Minimum bid is $5,000. Do I have $5,000? Clara raised her hand. Going once at $5,000. He looked at the developer. The developer looked at his phone. Going twice. Outside the narrow window above the county employee's head, a crow sat on a power line and looked at nothing in particular. Sold. She drove home in 11 minutes and parked outside her apartment building and sat with both hands on the steering wheel for 19 minutes. Not crying. Not in the grip of any particular emotion she could name cleanly. Just sitting with the fact of what she'd done, letting it become real, waiting for the panic that would have been reasonable and discovering that it wasn't coming. What came instead was something quieter and harder to describe. A sense of the decision being final and therefore no longer available to be second-guessed, which was its own kind of relief after 3 days of arguing with herself. She went upstairs. She stood in the doorway of Leo's room and watched him sleep. Then she went to the kitchen and put the county receipt on the table and looked at it for a long time, and something settled in her that she couldn't have explained to anyone who would have fully understood it. They moved in 3 weeks later, on a Monday, after the title had transferred and Clara had completed 6 evening assessment trips to the hotel with a clipboard and the structural checklist she'd compiled from 3 different online resources for commercial building condition surveys. The roof damage was real but confined. The foundation issue was smaller than the county's report had implied. The plumbing was old, but the pipes were copper and the system was structurally intact. The electrical needed a licensed inspection before she could use it at full capacity, but the building was not the catastrophe Diana believed it was. She borrowed a pickup truck from Diana's boyfriend, who had offered it without being asked because Diana had told him, and because he was a decent person who understood that his role in this situation was to help without commentary. Clara thanked him and meant it. Leo had never been inside the Ashworth Grand. He was 8 years old, and the building was the largest enclosed space he had willingly walked into in his life. And his response was the uncomplicated wonder of someone who hasn't yet learned to qualify experiences before having them. He stood in the lobby and looked up at the pressed tin ceiling and said, without preamble, "Mom, this is huge." "It is. Are we going to live here?" "For now, while we figure out what comes next." He walked in a slow circle, looking at everything. The reception desk with its shuttered terminals. The sitting area with chairs still under white dust covers. The staircase rising to 6 more floors that disappeared into the dimmer light of the upper building. A standing clock near the entrance that had stopped at some point during the 4 years the building had sat empty, its hands fixed at 7 minutes past 2. "Can I pick my own room? We're staying in the manager's apartment." Clara pointed to the door off the lobby marked private. "It's a real apartment, separate from the hotel part of the building. Small, but it works properly." Leo considered the terms. "Can I explore the rest of it later? With me?" "Yes." He nodded, accepted this, and went back to the truck for another box. The manager's apartment was exactly as small as she'd promised. 1 bedroom she gave to Leo. A sitting room barely large enough for a couch and a reading lamp, which became her sleeping space. A kitchen that worked. A bathroom with a shower head that produced a prolonged sound, like someone clearing their throat at length before finally delivering water. She told herself the couch was temporary and new, with some quieter part of her attention, that it probably wasn't. The first week was entirely physical. She went through the hotel floor by floor, room by room, with a systematic patience her mother would have recognized. Most of the guest rooms were intact in their bones. Mattresses stripped bare, furniture in place. Nothing of value remaining, but nothing destroyed. Meridian's renovation had reached through the 3rd floor before the money ran out, which meant the 4th through 7th floors still had the original Ashworth Grand interior. Dark wood paneling, small Art Deco light fixtures in bronzed metal, bathroom tile in soft green and cream that was someone's considered aesthetic decision from 1941 and had held up better than most decisions made by the people who came after. The ballroom on the 2nd floor was, from an adult's perspective, larger than she'd remembered it from childhood. Her childhood impression had been of something enormous and formal and faintly intimidating. The adult reality was that the room was genuinely large by any standard, the kind of space that could hold 300 people without crowding, with a sprung maple floor under its dust and a set of tall windows along the south wall that would fill the room with afternoon light when the boards came down. The chandelier was still in place, all 47 crystal drops on the outer ring, coated in 4 years of settled dust but intact. She stood under it for a long time on that first day, looking up, and felt something she couldn't name properly. Not grief, not nostalgia. Something closer to recognition. The presence of a thing that had held its shape through everything that had tried to change it. The kitchen had been gutted by Meridian to a degree that made it unusable, but the bones were good. Commercial-grade plumbing lines, a ventilation system that had been expensive when it was installed and would cost considerably less to bring back than to replace. A floor of quarry tile that had somehow survived the renovation intact. The dining room adjacent to it still had its original wainscoting and the built-in server station with the shallow drawers that she remembered Rosa opening occasionally to retrieve things that had been stored there since before either of them was born. Leo had discovered, by the 3rd day, that standing on the 2nd floor landing and speaking in a normal voice produced a remarkable acoustic effect in the lobby below, a deep resonance that made him sound much larger than he was. He'd been conducting experiments with this discovery at lengths that were beginning to test Clara's patience. But she let him run with it because his delight in the building was genuine and she didn't want to be the person who put limits on that. The routine settled into place naturally inside the first week. Days were for the work the building required. Calls with the county assessor's office, paperwork for restoring the utility accounts, conversations with 2 contractors about what needed addressing and in what order and for what cost. Leo's school ran from 7:40 to 3:15, and those hours were for the heaviest work. Evenings were for Leo, for homework and dinner made in the small apartment kitchen and the specific necessary conversations that 8-year-olds require about their days and their social concerns, and the ongoing injustices of the elementary school lunch table hierarchy. And then, after Leo was asleep, she started doing the midnight rounds. The first night happened by accident. She'd woken at 12:30 to a sound she couldn't identify. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. A pipe settling in the November cold, and she'd walked the first 2 floors with a flashlight to make sure it wasn't anything worse. The building at midnight was completely different from the building in daylight. Not threatening, not strange in the way people imagined when she described it later. Just very quiet, and very itself, in a way that felt private, like a face relaxed in sleep rather than composed for company. Like a place being most honestly what it was in the hours when no one required anything of it. She kept doing it. Every night after Leo went down, she walked the floors with her flashlight, checking the thermostats she'd set against pipe freezing in the November cold, listening at the foundation level for the sound of moving water, photographing things with her phone that she wanted to look at again in better light. She moved slowly and she thought, and the thinking was different at midnight than at noon, less frantic, less concerned with what she hadn't figured out yet, and more attentive to what was actually in front of her. She started to understand the building's particular rhythms, where the settling sounds came from, which windows let in cold air through gaps in the frames, which sections of corridor floor flexed slightly underweight in a way that suggested the subfloor had softened over the years. She saved the 3rd floor for the 4th night. The 3rd floor had been the long-term guest level, where the Ashworth Grand had kept its residency suites, rooms rented monthly by travelers who stayed for seasons rather than days, by people who needed a place to be for a while rather than a place to stay the night. Meridian's renovation had reached the corridor carpets here before the money stopped, which meant the hallway was bare concrete underfoot now, and all the original brass room numbers had been removed from the doors, leaving rectangular patches of slightly different paint where they'd been mounted for decades. The effect, in the beam of a flashlight, was of a corridor that had been erased, all identifying information stripped away, everything made anonymous. Most of the doors, at the far end of the corridor, at the last door before the fire exit, something was different. She noticed it before she was close enough to read the details, the way you notice something that doesn't belong to its surroundings before you can say exactly what it is. The door was heavy oak, the original material, dark with age, completely unlike the hollow core replacements Meridian had installed along the rest of the corridor. It had the original Ashworth Grand hardware, a lever handle in brushed bronze she recognized from childhood, the design that had been in this building since the 1940s. And it still had its room number. Brass numerals, dark with age, but carrying a low shine that looked deliberate rather than accidental. 318. Below the number, hanging from the handle on a short length of string, a laminated card in the hotel's old formal typeface. Long-term guest. Do not disturb. Clara stood in the corridor and looked at the door. She went through the master key set the county had transferred with the property, 37 keys on a ring, each labeled in the county's management system. She'd been using them for a week. She tried every key that might plausibly fit the lock, working methodically through the ring without forcing anything. None of them fit. The lock was not a standard hotel mechanism. She brought her flashlight close and looked at it carefully. It was different from every other lock in the building, older and more specific, a type she thought she recognized from photographs of pre-war hardware. The kind that required a key that couldn't be easily duplicated at a hardware counter. Someone had installed this lock in place of the original, or it was an original lock that Meridian's crew had encountered and decided to leave alone. The path of least resistance when you're renovating a building and its longest-tenured resident is still living on the floor you're updating. She stood at the door for a while, not out of frustration, but because she was thinking. Elias Vance, room 318 since 1989. He'd lived in that room for 30 years while the building changed ownership and the corridors were stripped and the renovation stalled and the bank took possession and the county seized the taxes. He'd been removed by court order in early 2020 when the bank had finally run out of patience for the legal standoff his occupancy had created. Moved to a care facility. Dead 8 months later. The obituary she'd found online had been 4 sentences long and mentioned his profession, but not his age, his work, but not his life, the things that could be stated publicly, but not the things that would have required someone who actually knew him to write them. His room had been sealed by the bank, according to the property records she'd reviewed before the auction, pending estate inventory and resolution. Estate resolution, the records noted with the dry brevity of legal deferrals, was ongoing. Ongoing apparently meant indefinite. 3 years had passed since the bank seized the building, and the inventory had never happened. She pressed her palm flat against the door. The wood was cold. Old oak holds cold differently from the engineered composite materials that replaced it in most modern construction, a fact her mother had mentioned once while explaining why the original third-floor doors needed to be handled differently in winter than the Meridian replacements on the lower floors. She'd been talking about cleaning cloths and temperature effects. Clara hadn't understood the full reason at the time. She understood it better now, holding her hand against 60-year-old wood in a November corridor. She lowered her flashlight to the gap at the base of the door. The threshold fit well, the door seated squarely in its frame in the way of something built to last rather than built to specification. The gap was narrow, but something reached her through it. She had to hold completely still to be certain she was smelling it and not projecting it onto the silence of the corridor. Old paper, old leather, the specific smell of books that have inhabited a room for a very long time. The smell of a place that has been lived in by someone who reads, that has accumulated years of pages and ink, and the particular quality of air that forms around a life organized around printed words. Not dust, exactly, though there was some of that. Something more purposeful. The smell of a collection. She straightened, looked again at the laminated card, at the brass numbers, at the quality of attention that had kept this door intact while everything around it was stripped and replaced and left to settle into whatever its new purpose was going to be, now that the person who'd defined its old purpose was gone. Then she brought her flashlight down again and looked more carefully at the base of the door, tilting the beam to catch the edge of the threshold from a lower angle. Something was there. She'd missed it on the first pass. It was flush against the threshold on her side, visible only because of the angle she was holding the light. A piece of paper, folded once, pushed through the gap from the other side at some point and undisturbed since. The fold had held its crease long enough that it had stiffened slightly. The edges had yellowed and softened, the way paper softens when it lies in the same position for years without being touched. Clara knelt on the concrete floor. She tilted the flashlight without touching the paper yet, reading what was written on the portion that faced outward. The handwriting was small and precise and careful. She had seen it before, in a letter she'd found in a small wooden box on her mother's dresser, among photographs and a medal and a watch receipt from another decade. It said, Rosa. Clara did not pick the paper up. Not yet. She stayed on her knees on the cold concrete floor of the third-floor corridor of a building she'd just bought with her dead mother's savings, and looked at a piece of paper addressed to her mother in the handwriting of a man who'd been dead for 3 years, pushed through the gap under a sealed door from the inside. And she thought about what kind of person does a thing like that. The answer she arrived at was, a person who expected it to be found. A person who believed, right up until the moment they left the building, or perhaps long after, that the right person would eventually come through this corridor and crouch down and look, the way she was looking now. Rosa had worked on this floor for 22 years. She'd moved through this corridor 5 days a week, for seasons a year, for more than 2 decades. She'd known every door. She'd have known this one better than any other because it was the one that required the most specific kind of attention, the care you give to a space occupied by someone who values their privacy above almost everything. Clara reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her phone. She photographed the paper in place before touching it, the position of the fold, the way it sat against the threshold, the yellowed edges. Then she picked it up. The paper was light, old and softened, but not fragile. She unfolded it. There was one sentence inside, written in the same careful hand as the address. When you come, bring someone who knows how to open things. Nothing else. No date. No signature. Clara sat back on her heels and held the paper in the beam of her flashlight and read that sentence 6 or 7 times. When you come. Not if. When. Elias Vance had known Rosa would come back to this building. Or he'd believed she would. He'd written that note on the assumption that Rosa would eventually stand in this corridor again, would find the paper, would understand what it meant. What he hadn't known, or what he'd known and had no control over, was that Rosa was dead. That she'd retired before the building was seized and died 14 months ago in a parking lot 3 miles away and would never stand in this corridor again. That the person who'd found the paper was not Rosa, but Rosa's daughter, who had spent $850 more than she had at a county auction because something in her that didn't answer to reason had said, go. She stood up slowly, looked at room 318. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went back downstairs to the manager's apartment and sat at the kitchen table with the piece of paper in front of her and thought about Elias Vance and a letter about serious eyes and a carved wooden fish she hadn't thought about in years until right now. Sitting in a building she'd bought because she couldn't explain why she shouldn't. The fish was in a box in the closet. She'd brought it without knowing she was bringing it, packed in with the things she'd gathered without thinking too carefully about what to keep. She got it out now and held it in her palm under the kitchen light. It was about 3 inches long, carved from a pail which she didn't know the name of, smooth with decades of handling. Whoever had made it had known what they were doing. The grain ran along the fish's body the way grain should when you know what you're working with, giving the figure a natural movement it didn't have in reality, the suggestion of something about to turn in water. The scales were suggested rather than literal, a series of shallow, curved lines that the light caught differently, depending on how you tilted it. The eye was a single pressed dot, small and precise. She'd been 7 years old when he handed it to her. She remembered looking at it for a long time in the hallway, turning it the way she was turning it now. She remembered Rosa watching her from the other end of the cart with an expression Clara hadn't been able to read at 7, but understood better now. The expression of someone watching two people recognize something in each other that neither of them has words for yet. Your Mr. Vance made you a present, Rosa had said later, which was the only thing she'd ever said about it. Clara set the fish on the table beside the piece of paper and looked at both of them under the kitchen light. When you come, bring someone who knows how to open things. She didn't know anyone who knew how to open things in the way she suspected that sentence meant. She knew contractors who could open walls. She knew a locksmith she'd found online whose reviews were good. She knew how to use tools that she'd been relearning since moving into this building, her hands recovering skills she'd let go dormant for 15 years. But the lock on room 318 was not a standard lock, and the note was not a standard note. And whatever was on the other side of that door, whatever Elias Vance had lived with for 30 years and sealed away when he left and addressed to Rosa in a handwriting that was careful and deliberate and had clearly meant what it said, was not going to be opened with anything as simple as a call to a locksmith. She needed to understand more before she could do anything useful. She needed to understand who Elias Vance had actually been, in a way that a 4-sentence obituary and a sparse online presence and a childhood memory of a man in a corduroy jacket could not tell her. She went back to the internet that night, after she'd checked all 3 floors above the manager's apartment and satisfied herself that nothing needed immediate attention. She went deeper this time, past the first page of results, past the obvious mentions, into the older records and the archived materials and the specialized databases she found through the library's remote access, the ones that required a library card she'd kept current out of habit since Leo started reading. Elias Vance had been born in 1936. He was 84 years old when the bank had him removed from room 318 in 2020. He'd studied at a university in Vienna in the 1950s, the records suggesting a focus in art history and classical antiquities, and had spent the following 2 decades working between the major European auction houses and a network of private clients whose names didn't appear in any public documentation she could find. He'd operated out of an address in Geneva through the 1970s, then shifted to Asia, then to the United States in the mid-1980s. He'd checked into the Ashworth Grand in the spring of 1989 and had, by all available evidence, never left. There were no published accounts of his work, no catalogs, no academic papers, no interviews. The kind of professional record that gets built by someone who works entirely through personal relationships and considers publicity a liability rather than an asset. Clara had dealt with enough dental patients who were also local business owners to recognize the pattern. Certain kinds of success depend entirely on discretion, and people who build those kinds of success understand that the moment they become visible is the moment they become vulnerable. Whatever Elias Vance had built over 50 years of working in the quiet margins of the Antiquities world, he'd built it carefully and kept it private. And at some point, he'd decided the Ashworth Grand Hotel in Kellerton, Oregon was where he wanted to keep it. Clara sat at the kitchen table with the carved fish and the folded note and the small and specific knowledge that she had bought a building she'd grown up in and found, inside it, a door she couldn't open and a message that had been waiting for someone who wasn't coming anymore. She thought about her mother going through that corridor 5 days a week for 22 years. She thought about the way Rosa had said your Mr. Vance made you a present, and the particular neutrality of her voice when she said it, the flatness that Rosa sometimes used to cover things she was being careful about. She thought about the letter on Ashworth Grand stationery and 22 years of consideration for his particular requirements, and the man who had thought Clara would amount to something considerable, given time. She thought about time. Then she turned off the kitchen light and lay down on the couch and stared at the ceiling and thought, for a long time, about what it would mean to open a door. She didn't sleep much. The couch was adequate for her body, but her mind ran through the same circuit for most of the night, and what it kept returning to was not the note or the door or even the handwriting she recognized. It was the sentence itself, the particular construction of it. When you come, not if you come, not in the unlikely event that someone finds this. When. The word had the certainty of someone who had made a decision and was done second-guessing it. When Leo came out at 6:30 and found her already at the table with her laptop open and 2 empty coffee cups pushed to one side, he looked at her with the particular assessment that children develop when they've learned to read a parent's face before saying good morning. Did you find something? She thought about how to answer that honestly. I found something I don't understand yet. I'm working on it. He poured himself cereal, accepted this, and went to school without pressing her further, which was one of the things she loved most about him. His instinct for when not to ask more. She had been sitting with the carved fish since 2 in the morning. She'd retrieved it from the kitchen table where she'd left it the night before and had spent the hours between 2 and 6 simply looking at it. The way you look at something you've seen 100 times once you suspect it's been hiding something. She turned it in her hands. She held it under the lamp and ran her thumb along every surface. The grain, the suggested scales, the single pressed eye. The wood was pale and close-grained. Some kind of fruit wood, she thought. Cherry, or perhaps pear, worn by decades of occasional handling to a surface that felt almost warm. She'd been holding it for 4 hours when she noticed it. The tail. She'd been looking at the body, at the scales and the eye, at the obvious places where craft is usually displayed. But the tail was a different piece. She felt it now with her thumb, pressing lightly, and what she felt was a seam. Narrow, nearly invisible, running along the line where the tail met the body of the fish, the kind of joint that could be either construction or concealment, depending on what the maker had intended. She pressed. Nothing moved. She turned the tail gently in one direction, then the other. The tail turned, counterclockwise, 3/4 of a rotation, and then the piece came free in her hand. The fish was hollow from its midsection to the tail. The cavity inside was small, no bigger than her thumb, lined with a scrap of oilcloth that had kept whatever was in it dry for however long it had been in there. Inside the cavity was a key. Clara set the 2 halves of the fish down on the table very carefully and picked up the key with 2 fingers. It was small, roughly 3 centimeters long, made from a dark metal that was neither brass nor steel, but something between them. The bow was cast in a simple oval. The blade had 3 angular cuts that she didn't recognize as corresponding to any lock type she knew. European, the locksmith would later confirm. Made specifically for a fichet mechanism. She'd been 7 years old when Elias Vance pressed this fish into her hand in the third-floor corridor of the Ashworth Grand Hotel. He'd said, "I made this when I was your age." He'd walked on without looking back. He had given a 7-year-old girl the key to his room and then waited to see how long it took her to understand. Clara sat at the kitchen table in the early November light and looked at the key for a long time and felt something that was not quite grief and not quite gratitude, but shared edges with both. She spent the first part of the morning on the phone with the county assessor's office, asking about the estate records attached to the property. The woman she reached was helpful in the patient, limited way of someone who can tell you what the file says, but not what it means. And what the file said was that the personal property of Elias Vance, long-term occupant of room 318, had been subject to a probate hold since his death in 2020, and that the hold had been placed by an attorney of record whose name the file listed as a firm she didn't recognize operating out of Portland. Clara wrote down the number and called it. She reached a receptionist who told her, in a tone that suggested this was not the first such inquiry, that the Vance estate was currently under legal review and that any questions about the estate's status should be directed to the managing attorney, who was not available, who would return calls within 5 to 7 business days. Clara thanked her and hung up and thought about 5 to 7 business days. Then she drove to the Kellerton County Public Library, which opened at 9, and spent 3 hours in the periodical archives. She'd never been a researcher in the academic sense. She'd done what most people do, searched online and accepted what the first 2 pages of results offered. But the Kellerton Library had a local history archive that wasn't digitized, a filing system maintained since 1942 by a succession of librarians who had understood that a community's memory lives in what it bothers to record, and that most communities don't bother to record nearly enough. She asked for the files on the Ashworth Grand Hotel and was given a banker's box that smelled of old cardboard and held 50 years of newspaper clippings, internal hotel documents that had been donated by former staff, and a collection of photographs that someone had organized by decade with a meticulous hand. The photographs from the 1990s showed the hotel in its working prime. Clara recognized the lobby, the ballroom, the dining room set for a service that looked like a Saturday night in the middle of a decade when the hotel had apparently been doing well. In several of the photographs taken on the third-floor corridor, she could see, at the far end of the hall, a closed oak door with a laminated card. Elias Vance appeared in exactly one photograph. It was taken at a charity event in the hotel's ballroom, from a distance, at an angle that suggested whoever took it hadn't been aiming for him specifically. He was standing near a window, a thin man in a dark jacket, holding a glass and looking at something outside the frame. He looked like someone who'd learned long ago how to be present in a room without being visible in it. She found 3 articles that mentioned him by name. The first, from 2003, was the one she'd already read, noting his agreement to remain in place during the Meridian transition. The second, from 2009, was a brief mention in a piece about the stalled renovation, noting that the hotel's sole remaining resident had filed a legal objection to certain renovation plans that would have required structural changes to the third floor. The objection had succeeded. The third article was from 2019, the year of the bank foreclosure. A local reporter had done a short feature on the Ashworth Grand's history and had attempted to interview its last remaining occupant. Elias had declined. The reporter had quoted an unnamed hotel employee describing him as a serious man, private but not unfriendly, who had lived in the same room for 30 years and seemed to regard the building's decline with the particular sorrow of someone watching an institution they depended on fail through no fault that could be attached to any one person. There was a sidebar in the same article that Clara almost missed, 2 paragraphs on the lower half of the page about the hotel's history of long-term residencies. It mentioned that several notable figures had used the Ashworth Grand as a base over the decades, businesspeople and artists, and one retired diplomat, whose name Clara didn't recognize. It mentioned, in the final paragraph, that the hotel had a reputation in certain circles as a discreet and reliable environment for people whose work required stability and privacy, and that this reputation had been carefully maintained by the management and staff, with particular credit to Rosa Navarro, head housekeeper for 22 years, who had understood before anyone had to explain it to her that the people who stayed the longest were the people whose requirements were most specific and most rarely mentioned. Clara put the clipping down and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. Her mother had built this. Not the building. The atmosphere. The specific quality of discretion that had made a private collector comfortable enough to keep a life's work in a hotel room for 30 years. Rosa had understood what the place needed from her before anyone told her, and she had provided it without announcement, and it had been the foundation of something neither of them had fully understood. She returned the banker's box and drove home and called a locksmith. Pete DeLuca ran a one-man operation out of a van he'd been driving for 20 years, and he came to the Ashworth Grand the following afternoon with the wariness of someone who'd been called to unusual situations before and knew enough to assess carefully before committing. Clara showed him room 318 without explanation, just the door and the lock, and watched his face shift from professional neutrality to genuine interest. He crouched down and examined the mechanism for 3 minutes without touching it. Then he stood. That's a Fichet H008. French. They made them from the late 1940s through the early 70s. He paused. Very good lock. Almost impossible to pick without destroying the mechanism, and destructive entry on a door this solid is going to do damage to the frame too. Is that acceptable? I'd rather not damage anything. He nodded slowly. Then you need the original key. They're registered. Fichet kept records. If someone ordered this lock new, there would be documentation with the manufacturer. The key is not the problem. Clara pulled the small dark metal key from her jacket pocket. He looked at it, then looked at her, then took it carefully in 2 fingers and examined it. He crouched again and held it near the lock without inserting it, comparing the blade's cut pattern to what he could see of the mechanism. He stood up again. Where did you get this? A man who lived in this room gave it to me when I was 7 years old. Pete DeLuca looked at her for a moment. This is going to work, he said. You want to open it now? She had not been prepared for the question to arrive that quickly. She'd expected more complication, more time to get ready. Not yet, she said. I need to understand a few more things first. He returned her key and left, respectfully, without asking for more than the call-out fee she paid him. She found Walter Prentice through the Historical Society, which occupied 2 rooms in the basement of the county library on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. She'd gone back to the library to return a phone call from the estate attorney's office and had noticed, on her way out, a handwritten sign on a corkboard advertising the Historical Society's open hours and the name of its current volunteer chair. She'd pulled the number off the sign without fully understanding why. Walter Prentice was 71 years old, retired from a 30-year career teaching European history at the community college, and he had the particular alertness of someone whose retirement has not involved slowing down in any way he found acceptable. He met Clara at the Historical Society's table on a Thursday afternoon and listened to what she'd found with the focused attention of someone for whom the past was not abstract. He knew who Elias Vance was. Not personally, he said, but by reputation. In certain circles, a narrow set of people who care about the provenance of significant objects, the name Elias Vance carried weight. He'd operated for 30 years at the intersection of art history and private acquisition, which was a delicate territory that required both deep knowledge and absolute discretion. He was considered one of the best in the world at what he did. Clara set the Historical Society's copy of the 2019 article on the table between them. What did he do specifically? Walter folded his hands on the table. The simplest way to say it is that he found things. Objects of historical significance whose ownership had become complicated over time, through wars, through displacement, through the kind of chaos that moves things from one hand to another in ways that make the original ownership difficult to trace. He specialized in establishing clear provenance for such objects and connecting them with appropriate institutions or private collectors. Museums worked with him. Major auction houses consulted him. He was regarded as someone who could be trusted to do the work honestly in a field where honesty was not universal. He'd lived in the Ashworth Grand for 30 years. Walter nodded slowly, which means he kept his work close. Some people in that field operate that way, by preference or by necessity. A private collection maintained in a controlled environment. A library. A workspace. The kind of thing you build over a career and don't want to move. Clara thought about the receipts she'd found in the storage locker off the hotel's loading dock, transferred with the property records. Elias had been having climate control equipment serviced in room 318 as recently as 2018. Specialized archival storage supplies. ordered from a company that served institutional collections. The room had been maintained with care long after the hotel itself had stopped being maintained with care. He spent 30 years building something in that room, she said. I'd be very interested to know what it is, Walter said, and his voice was quiet in a way that suggested he was being careful not to sound as interested as he actually was. The county estate attorney finally returned her call 4 days after she'd left her initial message. On a Friday morning, while she was on the second floor replacing a section of window molding that had deteriorated. His name was David Alcott, and he was matter-of-fact in the manner of a professional who had spent considerable time on a complicated problem and was no longer surprised by its complications. The Vance estate, he told her, was genuinely unusual. Elias Vance had died with assets distributed across 4 jurisdictions: Switzerland, where he'd maintained a financial account since the 1960s, France, where he had an apartment he'd stopped using in the 90s but had never given up, Japan, where 3 storage units held objects he'd chosen not to keep at the Ashworth Grand, and the United States, where the Kellerton Hotel room held the majority of what appeared to be his primary collection. The estate had been under simultaneous probate review in 3 of those 4 jurisdictions for 3 years. The coordination was complex. Attorneys in 3 countries had been working on it, and the work was ongoing, and the timeline for resolution was currently estimated at 2 to 4 more years. Clara stood on the second-floor landing of the Ashworth Grand with her window molding in one hand and her phone in the other, and asked, "What about the will?" Alcott was quiet for a moment. "There is a will. Properly executed, notarized, witnessed by 2 attorneys. It's not in dispute. The complication is that the estate's international dimensions require court approval in multiple jurisdictions before any distribution can take place." She asked about room 318 specifically. Another pause, longer. "There's a separate clause in the will addressing the hotel room and its contents. Clause 11. It stipulates that the contents of room 318 at the Ashworth Grand Hotel in Kellerton, Oregon, are to pass directly and entirely to the family of Rosa Maria Navarro, formerly of Kellerton, Oregon, at the time of the estate's formal close. The clause includes a secondary provision. If a member of Rosa Navarro's immediate family presents themselves in person to the estate's administrator, which is currently me, with appropriate identification, the clause becomes active and the contents of the room may be transferred without waiting for the broader estate to resolve." Clara sat down on the landing floor. He'd done it on purpose. Not just the key and the fish and the note under the door. The entire structure. A specific clause written so that a member of Rosa's family, if they found their way to the building and identified themselves, could claim what he'd left without waiting years for international probate to work its way to the end. He'd known Rosa might not come herself. He'd known there was a daughter. He'd made the path open to whoever came. "Mr. Alcott," she said, "my name is Clara Maria Navarro. Rosa Navarro was my mother. She died 14 months ago. I am her only surviving child. I purchased this hotel at county auction 3 weeks ago. I am currently sitting on the floor of the second-floor landing." Alcott was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to need to see identification and a copy of the death certificate. But Miss Navarro, if everything checks out, we can move quickly on this. I'll have everything to you by Monday." "One more thing," Alcott said. His voice dropped by a half-degree. "There have been other inquiries about the room. From attorneys representing interests I'm not able to name at the moment. They've been persistent. I want you to be aware that you are not the only party who has been trying to establish a claim." Clara looked at the window molding in her hand. The paint on it was cracked and old, and the wood underneath was sound. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I'll have the documents to you Monday." She got the documents to him on Saturday. Walter Prentice met her at the hotel on the Tuesday morning that Alcott confirmed, by email at 7:42 in the morning, that he'd reviewed her documentation and that Clause 11 of the Vance will was officially active and that the contents of room 318 were legally hers to claim. She called Walter from the parking lot of Leo's school after drop-off, and he arrived 40 minutes later with the quiet haste of someone who had been waiting for exactly this call. He brought a notebook and 2 pens and a pair of cotton gloves, which told her he'd been thinking about this moment for longer than she'd given him time to prepare. They stood in front of room 318 together. The brass numerals, the laminated card, the fichet lock, and the small dark key she'd been carrying in her jacket pocket for the past 10 days. "How long has this door been sealed?" Walter asked. The bank closed the room in early 2020, so just under 4 years. He looked at the door with the expression of someone standing in front of something they've been reading about and have just made real. Clara put the key in the lock. It went in cleanly, no resistance, the specific ease of a mechanism that was made for this particular key and no other. She turned it counterclockwise. She felt 3 distinct movements inside the lock, each one a slightly different register of sound, tumblers falling into their correct positions after nearly 4 years of waiting. The door swung inward. The smell reached her first. Old paper and old leather, and something else underneath it, something she couldn't identify at first, cool and dry and faintly mineral, like the air in a place that has been carefully maintained at a constant temperature for a very long time. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The room was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. It was larger than the standard Ashworth Grand guest room, occupying what had been 2 rooms knocked into one at some point in the building's history, leaving a space roughly double the size of what she'd seen on the floors above. The windows on the far wall were covered by heavy curtains that she would later learn were blackout lined, and the light they admitted at the edges was the pale gray of the November morning outside. The climate control unit was mounted to the wall beside the door, a commercial-grade system of a type she'd seen in museum storage areas. Its display read 65 degrees Fahrenheit and 45% relative humidity. It was still running, drawing power from the emergency circuit she'd had the electrician restore in the first week of ownership. The room was not cluttered. That was the first thing she understood clearly, once her eyes began to work properly in the dim light. It was organized with the precise, considered arrangement of someone who knew exactly what they had and exactly where they'd put it, who had thought carefully about how the pieces related to each other in space. Along the left wall, a series of flat files, the wide shallow drawer kind used for storing works on paper, 6 units stacked to shoulder height. Along the right wall, a row of vertical storage units with padded slots, the kind designed for canvases. In the center of the room, 2 large tables covered in archival tissue paper, and on each table, carefully positioned and padded, objects she couldn't identify from the doorway. At the far end of the room, a desk, a reading lamp, and a single wooden chair. Walter stepped in behind her, and she heard him inhale sharply. On the desk was a flat package wrapped in archival tissue and tied with cotton tape, and on top of the package, a sealed envelope. The envelope had her name on it. Not Rosa, not to whom it may concern. Clara Navarro, written in the careful handwriting she'd now seen 3 times, on the hotel stationery, on the note under the door, and now here. As if he'd known which of them would come. She stood in the center of the room and looked at it from a distance before going to the desk. She needed a moment. The room was pressing on her in a way she hadn't anticipated, not in fear but in weight. The weight of something that had been kept and kept and kept, and was now being seen for the first time by someone for whom it was meant. Walter was moving slowly along the left wall, not touching anything, his hands in the cotton gloves, his notebook open. He stopped in front of the flat files and looked at the labels on the drawer fronts. Each drawer was labeled in a small, consistent handwriting, a number and a letter code she didn't recognize. He turned to look at her. His face had a quality she hadn't seen from him before, a very particular stillness. "Clara," he said, "I think I know what this is." She walked to the nearest of the vertical storage units on the right wall. A canvas in a padded slot, protected in archival tissue. She could see only the stretcher bars from where she stood, old wood, hand-cut tenons at the corners in the manner of work done before power tools made everything uniform. She didn't touch it. She went to one of the center tables instead. The objects there were smaller. A bronze figure roughly 8 inches tall, green with the particular patina of something very old, wrapped loosely in acid-free tissue that had been pulled back slightly to show the piece. A horse, cast in a style she'd seen before in photographs of museum collections, the proportions and the surface treatment placing it somewhere in the territory of East Asian antiquity, without her being able to say more precisely. The second object on the table was wrapped still. She could see only its outline, a flat rectangular form, possibly a panel painting. "How many pieces are in here?" she asked. Walter was moving along the flat files, reading each label, writing in his notebook. "Without examining the drawers, I can't be certain. But these files hold works on paper. There are 48 drawers. If he stored pieces individually, We're looking at potentially 48 works in that unit alone. Then there are the canvases and panels, and the three-dimensional works. She looked around the room. She'd been doing math in a different context for months. The math of bills and shortfalls and the distance between what she earned and what she owed. This was a different kind of math, and her mind kept slipping off it because the numbers were too large to hold in the way smaller numbers could be held. She went to the desk. She sat in the wooden chair, which was uncomfortable in the upright, intentional way of furniture designed for serious work rather than comfort. She picked up the envelope with both hands. The paper was heavy, the good kind, cotton-based, the kind that lasted. She opened it carefully and took out the letter inside. It was 8 pages, handwritten on the hotel's old stationery, and it began, "Dear Clara, I have been trying to reach you since your mother's death and have failed to do so through the channels available to me. I am leaving this letter here, where I believe you will eventually find it if you find anything, because Rosa told me once that you were a person who finished what you started, and I have chosen to believe her." Clara looked up. She looked at the room around her, at the flat files and the vertical storage units and the padded center tables, at the climate control unit, still faithfully maintaining the conditions Elias Vance had specified. She looked back at the letter and kept reading. He wrote about the collection. He wrote about how he'd built it over 50 years of work in the antiquities trade, acquiring objects whose ownership had been disrupted by the 20th century's particular genius for displacing things from their contexts. He had spent his career tracing those disruptions, establishing clear documented provenance, and in the process had encountered pieces whose histories were so tangled, whose legitimate ownership was so impossible to establish through conventional means, that no institution would touch them and no major auction house would handle them. He had kept those pieces. He'd kept them carefully, in conditions appropriate to their age and their value, and he'd spent 30 years in this room building the documentation that would eventually make it possible to move them into the world properly. Some of the pieces were centuries old. Some had changed hands in ways that the 20th century's conflicts had made murky. All of them had documentation now, built by a man who had nothing else to do for 30 years except get it exactly right. His estimate of the collection's value, based on private appraisals he'd commissioned in 2016 and 2018, ran to a number she had to read twice before she believed she was reading it correctly. Between $350 and $400 million, depending on market conditions at the time of sale and the outcomes of certain authentication processes he'd initiated but not completed. Clara set the letter down on the desk. $350 million. At the low end. She'd been awake since 4 in the morning for 3 weeks running, doing math that produced numbers in the range of $400 difference between what she earned and what she owed. She didn't have a way to contain a number that large, no existing frame in her mind where it could sit and make sense. She picked up the letter again. He wrote about Rosa in the 5th page. He wrote about what it had meant to him, over 2 decades, to have a person in his immediate world who understood that the work of care was not a lesser form of work, who had treated his requirements not as inconveniences but as facts of a particular life, to be met as any other facts are met, practically and without resentment. He wrote that he had been isolated by choice and that Rosa Navarro's daily presence had been the specific form of human contact that his particular isolation could accommodate, and that he understood this was not a debt he could pay and was not trying to. He wrote about Clara. He wrote that he'd watched a serious-eyed child become, in the limited view available to him, a person who paid attention to things other people passed over. He wrote that he had given her the fish because he'd decided, the afternoon he made it, that the key should go to someone who had a reason to keep it. He wrote, "I gave it to you at 7 years old because I had already decided that you were the right person to hold it. I didn't know when you'd understand what it was. I didn't know if I'd still be alive when you did. I decided that didn't matter. The decision was made, and I kept it." He wrote about the people who would try to contest the collection after his death. He named 3 parties. An attorney in Zurich who had approached him twice with acquisition offers he had refused, a collector in Tokyo whose agents had been asking questions about his estate since 2015, and a law firm in Portland, Oregon, which he did not name directly, but which he said had been sending representatives to the Kellerton area since 2018, and which he believed was operating on behalf of interests that would prefer the collection to disappear rather than be properly accounted for. He wrote that Clara should move quickly. He wrote that the law and the documentation were on her side, but that the law moved slowly and the opposition would not. The final page was brief. I cannot tell you what to do with what I am leaving you. I can only tell you that your mother made 30 years of this work possible by being exactly who she was in exactly the way she was, and I cannot repay that. But I can try to give you the kind of future she would have wanted for you, which is to say one where the math works out. I am sorry it took this long. I am sorry I didn't find a better way to reach you. I believe Rosa knew this day would come, even if she didn't know when. She trusted you. I am choosing to do the same. With my sincere regards, Elias Vance. Clara sat at the desk in the room Elias Vance had lived in for 30 years and held the letter in both hands and did not cry, because she had the feeling that if she started she would not stop for a very long time, and there was too much to do. Walter had covered 2 pages of his notebook by the time she looked up. He was standing near the flat files with a quality of concentrated attention she hadn't seen from him before, the look of someone doing rapid, careful assessment and finding that every data point is confirming a hypothesis they're afraid to state too soon. Tell me what you're thinking, she said. He looked at her across the room. What I'm thinking is that I need to make a phone call, with your permission, to a colleague at the university in Portland. She spent her career in the authentication of European paintings and works on paper. If what I think I'm seeing in these labels and in this storage system is accurate, we need someone with her particular knowledge in this room as soon as possible. How soon? He already had his phone out. Tomorrow, if she can manage it. Marta Jansen drove down from Portland the following morning in a car that had seen better decades and arrived at the Ashworth Grand at 8:45 with a hard-sided case of equipment and the unhurried attention of someone who had spent 40 years in a field where wrong conclusions were expensive and hasty conclusions were wrong. She was 59, with silver hair cut practically short, and she wore the kind of clothes that were easy to move in and impossible to ruin, because a career examining old things had taught her that old things left traces. She said very little on the walk up to the 3rd floor. She said nothing when Clara unlocked the door. She stepped inside and stood still for 30 seconds, and then she set her case on the floor and opened it and went to work. Clara and Walter sat in the corridor outside the room and waited. Marta had asked for quiet and uninterrupted time, and the specific quality of the request made it clear this was not a preference, but a professional requirement. For 2 hours they heard nothing except occasional sounds of movement from inside the room, the careful sounds of someone working slowly and with complete attention. When Marta came out, she closed the door behind her and stood in the corridor with her case and her notebook and looked at Clara for a moment before she said anything. She said, "I need to ask you some questions about the provenance documentation in that room." Clara said, "I can show you the letter." Marta read it in the corridor, standing, without leaning against the wall, her posture the same whether she was reading or working or being still. She read it twice. Then she handed it back. "The drawings in the flat files," she said. "There are 7 that I've examined. 3 of them are consistent. In every particular I can assess with portable equipment, with late 15th century Italian draftsmanship. One of them, if the attribution in the file matches what I think I'm seeing, would be one of the most significant rediscoveries in the field in 50 years. I need 2 more days with proper equipment, and then I need to bring in a second opinion." Clara thought about the Portland law firm Elias had mentioned, the parties who had been making inquiries, the advice to move quickly. What does properly assessed mean in terms of timeline? For the collection as a whole, given its scope, a full appraisal would take months. Marta's voice was direct. "But I can give you a preliminary assessment of the highest value works within a week. That's what you need first. Documentation of what's here and what it's worth, in writing, under my name. And what do you think it's worth? Not the official number. Just what you think now." Marta was quiet for a moment. Then, the drawings alone, if the attributions hold, could reach 100 million at auction. The bronzes I looked at are museum quality, the kind that don't come to market often. The panel paintings I haven't fully examined yet. The documentation, the provenance records he built, adds significant value to every piece by resolving questions that have made similar works difficult to sell through legitimate channels. She paused. The number in his letter, 350 to 400 million, is not unreasonable. It may be conservative depending on what the panel paintings turn out to be. The corridor was very quiet. From somewhere below them, distantly, Clara could hear the sound of the building settling, the particular low sound of old materials in cold weather, the Ashworth Grand doing what it had always done. She thought about $2,340 in back rent. She thought about the couch she'd been sleeping on for 3 weeks. She thought about Leo's boots with the split seam she'd repaired with waterproof adhesive because replacement boots weren't in the budget. She thought about her mother, moving through this corridor 5 days a week for 22 years, bringing meals to a closed door, maintaining a silence she'd never been asked to keep because she'd understood without being asked that it was the right thing to do. "One more question," Clara said. Marta waited. "Is there anything in that room that shouldn't be here? Anything that raises concerns about how it was acquired?" Marta looked at her steadily. "The documentation I've seen so far is the most comprehensive provenance record I've encountered in private hands. Vance spent 30 years building the paper trail for every piece in that room. If anything in there has complications in its history, he documented those complications and documented the steps he took to resolve them. He wasn't hiding what he had. He was protecting it until it could be properly handled." Clara nodded. She stood in the corridor outside room 318 in the building she'd bought with the money her mother left her, in the building where her mother had worked for 36 years, in the corridor where a thin man in a corduroy jacket had once pressed a carved wooden fish into a 7-year-old girl's hand and said, without explaining himself, "I made this when I was your age." She understood now what he had meant. He hadn't meant the fish. He hadn't been talking about carpentry. He had been talking about patience, about building something carefully and keeping it carefully and trusting that the right person would eventually arrive, which was the only form of faith available to someone who had spent his life working in the long silences between one generation and the next. She turned to Walter. She said, "Tell me what I need to do first." And Walter, who had been waiting for this moment with the restrained excitement of a person who spends their life studying the past and very rarely gets to be present when the past becomes the present, opened his notebook to the first clean page and began to write. The days between finding the note and opening the door were not idle days. She worked the hotel's maintenance list from early morning until Leo came home from school, and she worked her research from the hours after he was in bed. The 2 tracks of her life ran parallel, the practical and the uncertain, and she was careful not to let either crowd out the other. Diana called on a Wednesday afternoon while Clara was on her knees in the second-floor men's room replacing the base of a toilet that had been leaking since before the hotel closed. Clara answered because ignoring Diana's calls was a strategy with a poor long-term record. "How are you doing up there?" Diana's voice had the careful neutrality of someone who has made a decision to stop arguing and hasn't quite arrived at genuine acceptance. "Fine. Working on plumbing." She cradled the phone against her shoulder. "Clara, the county assessor's office sent me a letter. They sent it to my address by mistake, something about property tax obligation transferring to the new owner. You're going to owe the first installment in March." "I know. I've been in contact with their office. That's another $6,000 you don't have." "I'm aware of the number, Diana." A pause. "I'm not trying to fight with you. I'm trying to make sure you're seeing the full picture." "I'm seeing it." Clara tightened the fitting and sat back on her heels. "There's something happening here that I can't fully explain to you yet. I need a few more weeks." "You keep saying that." "I keep meaning it." She dried her hands on her work cloth. "The plumbing is mostly sound. The electrical passed its inspection. I have 2 contractors coming next week to quote the roof work. The building is not the disaster you think it is." Diana was quiet for a moment. "Leo likes it there?" "Leo loves it. He's made a friend at his new school. He's been giving the friend tours of the building on weekends." A shorter pause this time. "You would." Diana's voice shifted, the resistance in it softening by a degree. "Mom would have liked knowing you were there." "I know," Clara said. After the call ended, she sat on the second-floor bathroom floor for a moment and thought about how to tell Diana what she'd found, when to tell her, and what would happen to her sister's face when she heard it. She decided to wait until she had Marta Jansen's written assessment in hand. She wanted paper when she had that conversation. Proof, in the form that Diana trusted. Something documented, verifiable, signed. She'd found the storage locker on the property during her second week of building assessment. It was off the hotel's loading dock, a room that appeared on the original hotel plans as receiving storage, and that contained, in addition to old kitchen equipment and a stack of mattresses from the lower floors that someone had apparently moved before the bank took possession, 3 cardboard boxes with Elias Vance's name written on the top in the same handwriting as everything else. The boxes were materials that had apparently lived outside the room. administrative papers, correspondence with suppliers of the storage systems and the climate control unit, receipts for services rendered to room 318 over 30 years. Reading through them had told her things the room itself couldn't tell her. He'd had the climate control system serviced annually by the same HVAC contractor from 2001 through 2019. He'd ordered archival tissue and acid-free storage materials in bulk from a museum supply house every 18 months. He'd had the fichet lock inspected and maintained by a specialist locksmith from Portland, the same specialist, every 5 years from 1994 through 2014. After 2014, the locksmith's invoice stopped appearing, which was when she found, in the same box, a brief handwritten note from the locksmith saying he was retiring and his files were being transferred to his nephew, who operated a different business and whose specialty was not historical mechanisms. After 2014, Elias had maintained the lock himself. He'd ordered the appropriate lubricants from a specialist supplier in France. The receipts were there, each one small and precise, the record of someone who understood that certain things needed to be done correctly and could not be done by anyone who didn't know what they were doing. She'd found one other thing in the boxes that she'd set aside and kept coming back to. A Christmas card, undated but with an envelope postmarked 1997, addressed to Elias Vance at the Ashworth Grand Hotel. The card was from Rosa. Inside her mother's handwriting, the slightly formal English she used in writing as opposed to the more relaxed way she spoke. Dear Mr. Vance, I hope you are well and that the season finds you in good health. My daughter Clara drew this for you. And taped to the inside of the card was a child's drawing, crayon on paper, of a man in a brown jacket standing next to a fish. She was 14 in 1997. She had no memory of making that drawing. But her mother had sent it, carefully, to the man in room 318, and he had kept it in a box with his service records for 26 years. She thought about that for a long time, on different nights, in the quiet of the manager's apartment after Leo was asleep. Her mother had understood something Clara hadn't. Rosa had known, in the way she knew things without needing them explained, that the connection between her daughter and the man in room 318 was worth tending. She'd been tending it quietly, with Christmas cards and drawings and the daily attention she brought to everything in her care, without saying a word about it to Clara. Not because she was hiding it, because she was Rosa, and Rosa did not explain the things she did. She simply did them. Marta Jansen returned for her second day with a colleague, a man in his late 60s named Peter Solberg who specialized in East Asian bronzes and who spent 4 hours in the room with equipment Clara had never seen outside of a documentary about museum conservation. He said very little to anyone outside the room. What he said inside it, to Marta, was not audible from the corridor. When they came out at the end of the second day, they sat with Clara in the hotel's lobby, in the chairs still arranged under their dust covers, the pressed tin ceiling above them holding the last of the afternoon light, and Marta gave her a preliminary accounting. The collection was 112 pieces. Of those, she had been able to examine 47 in detail. Of the 47, 11 carried attribution to named historical figures that she was prepared, under professional qualification, to support with her signature. 3 of those 11 were what she called Category 1 attributions, meaning that she had sufficient confidence in the work's identity that she would stake her professional reputation on the finding. Peter Solberg, who had spent 30 years examining objects similar to the bronzes in the room, had found 6 pieces of what he considered museum significance. 2 of them he had seen referenced in pre-war documentation that suggested their previous location before the middle of the 20th century, and the provenance files Elias had built around them connected those references to their current state in a way that was, in Solberg's carefully chosen words, the most thorough private documentation I have encountered in 4 decades of this work. Marta put a number on paper and pushed it across the dust cover of the nearest chair toward Clara. It was a range, low to high, representing the 47 pieces she'd fully assessed. Clara looked at the number. The low end of the range was $112 million. She put the paper face down on the chair and looked at the chandelier. The 47 crystal drops on the outer ring caught what remained of the afternoon light and held it in small points, each one a slightly different angle from the others. Marta said, "The remaining 65 pieces will take another 3 weeks to assess properly. But based on what I've seen of the storage and documentation standards, I have no reason to expect the quality to decrease." Clara kept looking at the chandelier. She thought about a sentence from Elias's letter, the one she'd come back to most often in the nights since she'd read it. He had written that Rosa Navarro had made 30 years of this work possible, not by doing anything extraordinary, not by anything other than showing up and doing what needed to be done, and understanding without being told that some work has to be cared for rather than simply managed. The chandelier held 47 points of light in the November afternoon. Clara had counted them when she was 6. She thought, my mother never knew. She'd given 36 years to a building and been good to the man in room 318 because it was the right thing to do, and because Rosa Navarro did not need a reason beyond that to behave decently towards someone in her care. She'd never known what was in the room. She'd never known the letter existed. She'd sent a Christmas card with a child's drawing taped inside it and never mentioned it. And she died 14 months ago in a parking lot 3 miles away without ever understanding what she'd made possible. Clara pulled the paper back from the edge of the chair and looked at the number again. Marta was watching her quietly. How do we protect this? Clara asked. Before word gets out. Marta exchanged a look with Peter Solberg. Then she said, that's the most important question you could be asking right now. And the answer starts tomorrow. The answer to how you protect something worth $380 million turned out to be fast, publicly, and in writing. Alcott filed Clause 11's activation papers with the Oregon Probate Court on a Thursday morning. The filing established Clara's claim to the contents of room 318 as legally separate from the broader Vance estate and not subject to the international probate timeline affecting his other assets. He'd had the language reviewed by 2 colleagues before submitting it. He told Clara it was clean, and he said it in the tone of someone who had been in this field long enough to know that clean was not guaranteed. Marta Jansen contacted a private security firm that specialized in cultural property protection. By Thursday afternoon, 2 people from that firm were stationed at the Ashworth Grand, with instructions that no one entered the 3rd floor without Clara's explicit consent. They were quiet and professional and unobtrusive in the way of people trained to be present without being noticed, and their presence in the building changed its atmosphere in a way Clara felt, but couldn't entirely describe, as if the building had suddenly understood it was being taken seriously. Walter had advised publicly early, and he'd been clear about his reasoning. People with resources and motivation can move through legal systems faster than the systems are designed to move, he said. The best protection against that is light. If the discovery is a matter of public record, any attempt to suppress it or redirect its outcome becomes a matter of public record too. Clara called the Kellerton Register on Friday morning and asked to speak with someone about an art collection. The reporter who drove to the Ashworth Grand that afternoon was a woman in her late 30s named Patricia Cobb, who had covered local news in Kellerton for 11 years and who arrived with a photographer and the controlled expression of someone trying not to let anticipation show. Clara walked her through the story methodically, from the auction listing found on a Tuesday night to the fichet lock and the key in the carved fish's tail to Marta Jansen's preliminary assessment and the letter on Ashworth Grand stationery. She showed Patricia the note that had been pushed under the door. She did not let the reporter enter room 318. She showed her the hallway, the oak door, the laminated card. Patricia Cobb's piece ran in the Sunday edition under a careful headline. It was 800 words and included a photograph of Clara standing outside the Ashworth Grand's front entrance, looking at the building rather than at the camera, which was the one the photographer chose over the posed alternatives and which turned out to be the right choice. By Monday morning, the Associated Press had picked it up. By Tuesday, for national publications and 2 major art world outlets had run their own versions of the story. By Wednesday, the Ashworth Grand's address was appearing in news aggregators alongside words like Discovery and Reclusive and Fortune, and the phone in the manager's apartment was ringing so often that Clara turned the ringer off and let calls go to voicemail, working through them in batches at noon and 7 in the evening. The Portland law firm filed its injunction on Wednesday afternoon. Alcott called her about it at 4, with the equanimity of someone who had been expecting exactly this. They're claiming the collection is part of the general estate and subject to the international probate process, he said. The argument is that Clause 11 represents a preferential transfer that disadvantages the estate's other potential beneficiaries. Are there other beneficiaries? Not that anyone has been able to identify. Vance had no living relatives. The Swiss account names a charitable foundation in Zurich as the residuary beneficiary after all specific bequests are honored. Clause 11 is a specific bequest. The foundation gets what's left over, which will still be significant given his other assets. There's no credible injured party here. Then why are they filing? Alcott was quiet for a moment. That's the correct question. The firm's client is unnamed. Whoever is paying their fees wants this process slowed down enough to allow other legal maneuvers. My recommendation is that we respond quickly and that our response makes very clear we understand what's actually happening. File the response, Clara said. The injunction was denied 11 days later. The judge's ruling was brief and made several pointed observations about the quality of the filing. Diana called on a Sunday morning, the second Sunday after the story broke. Clara had known the call was coming. She'd been waiting for it the way you wait for a weather change you can feel before it arrives. Her sister's voice was different from any version of it Clara had heard before. Not the careful neutrality of the calls after the auction, not the concern dressed as practicality that had been Diana's register for the past 2 years. Something underneath all of that, something older. I saw the article, Diana said. I know. Clara was sitting on the back step of the manager's apartment in the morning cold, coffee in both hands. She'd taken to doing this in the mornings, the 10 minutes before the day started. I told you not to buy it. Diana's voice was not accusing. It was something quieter, more honest than that. You did. I was wrong. The silence between them had a different quality from their usual silences, the ones filled with the unsaid things that accumulate between people who love each other and know how the other one thinks. This silence felt cleaner. Clara said, you weren't wrong to be concerned. The reasonable thing to think was what you thought. The reasonable thing. Diana's voice bent slightly around the words. Clara, you spent Mama's money on a feeling. A feeling that turned out to be right, but still, I had a little more than a feeling, but not much more. She could hear Diana breathing on the other end, the sound of someone composing themselves. Do you know what I keep thinking about? Diana said. I keep thinking about how many times I went to see Mama at that hotel when she was working. The years I was in high school. She'd be on that third floor with her cart, and I'd come in to meet her after school sometimes, and she'd be moving between those rooms like she owned the place. Not arrogant, just very sure of what she was doing. And she'd always go to the very end of the corridor last. Always. And I never asked her why. Clara didn't say anything. She knew why. She was saving the best for last. Diana stopped. I don't mean the best room. I mean him. Mr. Vance. She was always careful with that room. She spent more time on it than the others. I could tell even then. Even as a teenager. She gave it extra. Because she understood he deserved it. Because she understood, Diana said, and left that sentence there without adding to it. They stayed on the phone for another 20 minutes, not saying anything particularly important, just being in the same call the way sisters sometimes need to be. Before they hung up, Diana said, what are you going to do with it? The hotel. Restore it. The original way? As close as I can get. Clara looked back at the building's rear entrance, at the brickwork that needed pointing, at the window above the kitchen that had a replacement sash in the wrong style. Room by room. The way Mama would have done it. Diana was quiet for a moment. Good, she said finally. Terri called that same week, on a Thursday evening while Clara was making dinner. Leo was at the kitchen table working on a science project involving a model of the solar system that had already colonized 2/3 of the available table surface. Clara answered with the phone between her ear and her shoulder and kept stirring. I said you couldn't afford feelings, Terri said, without preamble. Clara smiled at the pot on the stove. You said that. I said you needed to get through the next 90 days without losing your apartment. That's also what you said. Clara, I was completely wrong, and I am calling you to say that directly. You weren't wrong about the circumstances. I was wrong about what to do about them. There was a pause and then, in a different tone, how did you know? When you looked at that listing at 1 in the morning, how did you know it was the right thing? Clara thought about this honestly. I didn't know. I had a feeling that was bigger than the logic against it, and I made a decision I couldn't explain. You were giving me the logical advice. It just wasn't the advice that mattered. A longer pause. Can I come see it? The hotel? Any time, Clara said. The co-worker from the dental office, a woman named Karen who had overheard Clara mentioning the auction 3 weeks before she left the job and had laughed in the particular way of someone who thinks they're being kind by managing someone else's expectations, sent a text on the Monday after the national coverage ran. It was 3 sentences long and carefully worded in the way of someone who had spent considerable time composing something and was still uncertain about it. Saw the news about the hotel. That is really amazing. I always thought you were so brave. Clara read it on her lunch break and put her phone in her pocket and went back to directing the roofers who'd started on the 6th floor. She responded 3 days later, after she'd thought about it. Thank you. The work is going well. She sent nothing else, and she didn't feel particularly righteous about it, just clear. The developer from the auction called on a Tuesday, through a general inquiry form on the property's newly registered business address. His name was in the signature of the email, Randall Coates, Coates Property Development. He'd done some research. He knew now what the hotel had been in its prime, what the building was worth in its current market, what the combined value of the property and its contents represented. He was prepared, he wrote, to make an offer that he believed would be competitive and that would allow him to bring the hotel back to profitability quickly with resources he had immediately available. Clara read the email once and then forwarded it to Walcott, not because she needed legal advice about whether to respond, but because she wanted Walcott to understand the range of interest that was now circling the Ashworth Grand. She wrote back to Coates herself, "Thank you for your inquiry. The hotel is not for sale." She pressed send without rereading it. She thought about Coates at the county auction in his fleece vest and his development company lanyard, doing his math in his small notebook and recapping his pen. She thought about the 47 seconds of quiet after the county employee announced the minimum bid, the seconds during which every other person in the room had decided the building was not worth $5,000. She did not think about this with triumph, exactly. She thought about it the way you think about a narrow road you've driven down after dark without knowing where it went, with the specific, quiet gratitude of someone who came out the other side. The first thing she did with money was not dramatic. Walcott arranged in advance against the collection's value, a standard provision in situations where a significant asset was in the process of being secured and appraised and could not immediately be liquidated. The advance was $250,000, deposited in a new account in Clara's name, and she sat in front of her laptop and looked at the balance for a long time before she did anything with it. The first transfer she made was for $6,300, paid to the Kellerton County Library Archive Fund, specifically designated for the digitization of its local history collection. She didn't call anyone about it. She didn't send a note. She just made the transfer. The second thing she did was call Leo's school and let them know he'd be staying. Not moving again. No need to update the enrollment for a transfer. He was staying. The school's administrative coordinator said, "That's great news. He's been doing really well." Clara sat with that information for a moment. "I know," she said. "Thank you." She paid back Diana's boyfriend for the pickup truck rental from the moving day, $200, which he refused and which she made into a grocery card and left at Diana's house without telling her it was coming. She paid the debt she owed Terri from 2 years ago, a loan she'd been paying back in $50 increments, paid in full in one transfer with a text that said only, "Thank you for being someone I could ask." She called the dental office on a Tuesday and gave 2 weeks' notice. The office manager received this news with the careful expression of someone who had already seen the news coverage and was processing multiple things simultaneously. Clara thanked her for the years of work, meant it in the moderate way you mean gratitude for something that served its purpose without being what you'd have chosen, and completed her 2 weeks without drama. The thing she bought for herself first was a mattress. Not a grand gesture, not something that could be photographed for a story about transformation. A mattress, a good one, with a proper foundation, ordered from a local store and delivered to the manager's apartment on a Saturday morning while Leo watched from the doorway and announced that it looked comfortable without having touched it, which was the kind of assessment he specialized in. She slept on it that night and woke up 6 hours later feeling, for the first time in as long as she could clearly remember, like she'd actually rested. She lay there in the dark and took stock of that fact, and then got up and made coffee and went to work, which was what she did, which was what she had always done. The hotel's restoration was not a quick process, because it was not designed to be. She'd hired Walter Prentice as historical consultant, a title that made him visibly pleased in the way of someone who has spent 30 years teaching history and is now being asked to participate in it. His role was to advise on what the building had actually been, room by room and detail by detail, so that what was restored was genuinely restored rather than interpreted. He came in 3 days a week with his notebook and his copies of the historical archive photographs, and he moved through the building with the same steady attention he brought to everything. She hired 2 local contractors, one for the structural work and one for the interiors, after interviewing 6. She chose them not for price, which was no longer the deciding factor, but for the quality of their explanations of what they intended to do and why. She wanted people who understood the difference between fixing a building and restoring one, and finding them took time. A young woman named Sophie Reyes started in January as a management intern, placed through the community college's new hotel management program. She was 22 years old, focused in the specific way of someone who had identified what she wanted and was pursuing it without apology, and she reminded Clara, in certain moments and at certain angles, of who Clara might have been if circumstances had run differently. Sophie made lists. She arrived early and stayed late. She asked questions that showed she'd been thinking between visits. Clara gave her progressively more responsibility and watched her handle it. The collection left the Ashworth Grand on a Wednesday in December, transferred under the supervision of Marta Jansen and the security firm to a climate-controlled storage facility in Portland where the authentication process could continue properly. Watching it go felt like a particular kind of loss, though it was a loss she'd chosen because she understood that keeping the collection in a hotel room, even a climate-controlled one, was not the right outcome for what Elias had built. She kept the carved fish. It sat on the kitchen windowsill of the manager's apartment, reassembled, the 2 pieces fitting back together with the same clean precision that had kept the key hidden for what turned out to be 27 years. Some mornings she picked it up and held it before the day started, the way she'd held it that night at 2 in the morning before she understood what it was. The wood was warm in her hand. Old fruitwood, Marta had confirmed, pear most likely, worked by someone who understood grain direction and had the patience to follow it. She visited Rosa's grave on a Saturday in February, leaving Leo at the hotel with Walter, who was teaching him to identify wood types by examining the end grain, an occupation Leo had announced he found extremely interesting and which Clara suspected would be interesting to him for approximately one more Saturday before he moved on to something else. She drove to the cemetery by herself and stood at the grave for a while without saying anything planned. She'd thought she might say something eloquent. She'd been composing something in her head for weeks, some version of, "I found it, and it was because of you, and I hope you knew how much all of it was worth." But standing at the grave in the February cold with her hands in her jacket pockets, the composed thing felt wrong, too prepared, the kind of speech Rosa would have had no patience for. What she said instead was, "You knew about the Christmas card with the drawing. You knew the whole time." She stood there a while longer. Then she said, "The hotel is looking good. Really good. You'd like it." She drove back. The full authentication report came in March. Marta's team had spent 4 months examining all 112 pieces in controlled conditions, with multiple specialists involved for the pieces that required specific expertise. The report was 180 pages long, illustrated, with complete provenance documentation for every piece cross-referenced against Elias's own files. The findings confirmed and extended the preliminary assessment. Of the 112 pieces, 89 carried fully documented provenance. Of the remaining 23, 17 had documentation that was substantial but not complete, and Marta's recommendation was that those be offered through a major auction house, with the existing documentation clearly disclosed, which would allow buyers to conduct their own additional research. 6 pieces were flagged for further investigation, not because of any indication of improper acquisition, but because the historical disruptions in their ownership trails were complex enough that more work was needed. Total estimated value for auction, conservatively assessed, $382 million. Alcott called her with the number on a Thursday morning. She was on the 4th floor at the time, watching one of the contractors restore a section of the original window molding that had been damaged in the Meridian renovation. The contractor was a methodical man named Howard who had worked on historic buildings for 30 years and who approached each piece of original material with the seriousness it deserved. $382 million, Alcott said. She watched Howard work the molding, his chisel moving in small, controlled strokes. "Okay," she said. "Is that the response you want to go with?" She thought about it. "That's a lot of money," she said. "It is. Is the auction timeline still looking like summer?" "Early fall is more realistic." We want the international aspects of the estate fully resolved before the major pieces go to market. But the preliminary sale of the lower-tier works could begin this spring, and that alone will generate significant liquidity. Howard set down his chisel and examined the molding with the focused attention of someone checking their own work honestly. He picked up the chisel again and made 2 more cuts. "Keep me posted on the timeline," Clara said. "And thank you." She put her phone in her pocket and went back to watching Howard work. The Ashworth Grand received its certificate of restored operations from the county on a Friday in June, which meant the basic infrastructure had passed inspection and the hotel could legally reopen, when it was ready, without additional county review. Walter organized a small private ceremony involving himself, Clara, the 2 contractors, Sophie Reyes, and Leo, who brought a camera he'd been borrowing from the school's media lab, and photographed everything with the serious attention of someone who understood that this moment would eventually be history and was therefore worth documenting properly. They stood in the lobby under the chandelier, which had been professionally cleaned for the first time in 4 years, and Clara looked up at the 47 crystal drops on the outer ring, holding the June afternoon light. Clean glass held light differently from dusty glass. She hadn't known that until she saw it. Walter raised a paper cup of sparkling water. He said, "To the Ashworth Grand." They said it back to him. Leo photographed the chandelier from directly below, lying on the lobby floor, and pointing the camera straight up, which was not a composition anyone had suggested to him. When Clara looked at the image later, on his phone while he was asleep, it was the best photograph of the chandelier she'd ever seen. The drops caught the light from every angle simultaneously, 47 small stars suspended above the lobby floor, the architectural geometry of the ceiling fanning out around them in a pattern she'd never noticed before, or hadn't noticed since she was 6 and small enough to see the whole ceiling simply by looking at it. She kept the photograph. She printed it and put it on the kitchen windowsill beside the carved fish. What she thought about, in the quiet hours of that summer, was not the $382 million. That number lived in Alcott's office, in Marta's report, in the accounts that were growing in ways she was still learning to understand. It was real, but it wasn't what she thought about. She thought about her mother moving through a corridor 5 days a week for 36 years, pushing a cart that held everything required to care properly for a building full of people who mostly would not remember being cared for. She thought about Rosa knowing without being told what Elias Vance needed, and meeting those needs without announcement, and treating his privacy as something that belonged to him rather than something she was managing on behalf of the hotel. She thought about 22 years of that, day after day, the work that doesn't produce a certificate of completion or a headline or a number that can be quoted in a news article. She thought about what that work had made possible, not directly, not in a way that could be drawn as a straight line from cause to effect, but the atmosphere of genuine care that Rosa had maintained around Elias for 22 years was the foundation of his trust, and his trust was what allowed him to stay in that room and do his work and build what he built. And what he built, when the right person finally found it, was worth $382 million. The math worked out eventually. It just took 36 years and a daughter to see it. On a morning in late July, before Leo was awake and before Sophie arrived for her shift, and before the contractors came for the day's work, Clara did the building walk she'd been doing since November. The Ashworth Grand at 6 in the morning in summer was different from what it had been at midnight in November. The light came in at different angles and from different directions, the east-facing windows on the upper floors catching the early sun and distributing it through the corridors in long gold bars that moved as the sun moved. She went up to the 7th floor first, which was the floor they'd finished most recently, the rooms properly restored to their original configuration and decoration, ready to receive guests when the opening date was confirmed. She walked the corridor slowly, the way she'd walked it in the first weeks with a flashlight. The corridor now smelled of fresh paint and refinished wood, and the clean linen scent that had been there every day of her childhood. 6th floor, 5th, 4th, each floor at a different stage. The work proceeding from the top down because the roof was done and the structural work was finished, and now it was about detail, about returning each room to what it had been, about getting it right. 3rd floor. She stopped at the end of the corridor. Room 318 was different now, not from any structural change, but from the simple fact of the door standing open. She'd propped it open after the collection left in December and hadn't closed it since. The room was empty. The flat files and the vertical storage units and the padded tables all transferred to Portland with the collection. The climate control unit was still in place, still running, because she hadn't yet decided what to do with it, and because removing it would feel, in some way she couldn't quite articulate, like the last closure of something that deserved to close more slowly. She stood in the doorway and looked at the empty room. The desk was still there. The wooden chair, intentionally uncomfortable. The reading lamp. The curtains on the far wall, still pulled, still blocking the light that the windows would otherwise let in. She went to the windows and opened the curtains. The morning came in. Light reached the room that Elias Vance had lived in for 30 years, the room he'd left in 2020 and died 8 months later without returning to, the room where he'd built what he'd built and kept what he'd kept and left instructions for whoever came. The light moved across the floor and the walls and the desk and touched the space where 30 years of carefully stored objects had been and were no longer. She thought about a thin man in a corduroy jacket pressing a carved wooden fish into a 7-year-old girl's hand and saying, without explaining, "I made this when I was your age." She'd been 47 years before she understood what he meant, though she'd been carrying the fish for most of it. He'd been talking about what outlasts you. He'd been talking about the work you do carefully, without guarantees, on the faith that someone with the right eyes will eventually find it. He'd spent 50 years building something in this room, and he'd put the key in a 7-year-old's hand because he'd decided, the afternoon he made the fish, that she was the one who would know what to do with it. He'd been right. He'd been right about the serious eyes and the daughter who finished what she started and the building that could hold something worth finding if someone paid close enough attention. She stood in the empty room for a while, in the morning light. Then she heard Leo's voice downstairs, the sound of him moving through the lobby, talking to himself the way he did when he was doing something he was interested in. She heard him on the stairs, and then on the second floor, and then she heard the particular acoustic effect he'd discovered on his first day in the building, his voice resonating through the lobby below, saying something she couldn't quite make out from this distance. She went to the doorway of room 318 and called down the corridor, "Leo." His voice came back, shaped by the building into something larger. "What?" "Come up to the 3rd floor. There's something I want to show you." She heard him coming up the stairs, his footsteps taking them 2 at a time the way he always did, and she went back to the center of the empty room and waited. He appeared in the doorway. He looked at the room, at the open curtains, at the morning light filling the space. Then he looked at her. "Is this the room? The one with all the stuff in it?" "This is the room." He stepped inside and looked around, with the unhurried attention of someone taking something seriously. He was not yet 9 years old. He had his mother's way of looking at things. "It doesn't look like much now," he said. "No," Clara said. "It doesn't. But for 30 years, a man kept something in this room that he'd spent his whole life building. Something he cared enough about to protect very carefully and leave to someone who he hoped would find it." Leo looked at the desk, the chair, the lamp, the place on the floor where the flat files had stood. Why didn't he just keep it himself? Leo asked. Or give it to a museum or something. Clara thought about how to answer this in a way that was true and that an 8-year-old could hold. "Because some things can only be held by a certain kind of care," she said. "And some people understand that, and they choose who they trust with it very carefully, and then they wait to see if they were right." Leo looked at the morning light on the floor. "Were they right?" he asked. She thought about her mother's face at the end of a workday, tired in the specific way that genuine effort produces, the tiredness that is also its own satisfaction. She thought about 36 years of corridors and carts and closed doors, and the Christmas card with the drawing taped inside, and the morning Rosa died in a parking lot 3 miles away, going about her Saturday the way she always had. "I think so," Clara said. "I hope so." She looked at the room, at the light in it. "That's what I'm trying to make sure of." Leo was quiet for a moment. The building held its particular morning quiet around them, the specific silence of a place being carefully returned to itself. Then he said, "Can I go photograph the chandelier again? The morning light on it is different from the afternoon light, and I want to see if the image comes out differently." "Go ahead," Clara said. She listened to his footsteps receding down the corridor, down the stairs, into the lobby below. She heard him settle onto the floor in the position she'd seen in the photograph he'd taken in June, lying on his back with the camera pointing straight up. She looked at the room around her one more time. 37 keys on a county ring, none of them the right one. A carved fish with a hollow tail. A note pushed under a door in careful handwriting, addressed to a woman who would never read it. A letter in a sealed envelope left on a desk in a climate-controlled room by a man who understood that the right person would eventually come, given time, given the kind of patient attention that her mother had spent 36 years demonstrating was possible, and that Clara had inherited without knowing it was something that could be inherited. The Ashworth Grand held the morning light the way it had always held things, without announcement, without any particular awareness of its own value, simply by being what it was and letting what needed to happen inside it happen. Clara pulled the curtains gently to their previous position, not fully closed, letting a narrow band of July sun lie across the floor of the empty room. She left the door open behind her. She went downstairs to where her son was lying on the lobby floor, photographing the chandelier in the morning light, and she stood in the doorway and watched him work with the same serious attention he brought to everything. This child who had her eyes and his grandmother's patience, and, she suspected, a great deal of time ahead of him in which to figure out what he was going to do with both. She didn't interrupt him. She let him finish. Then they went to the kitchen and she made breakfast, and the day started, and the hotel stood around them the way it always had, holding whatever was placed inside it with the steady, unremarkable faithfulness of something built to last. The spring that preceded all of that was complicated in specific and manageable ways, which was a different category of complicated from the kind Clara had been living with for 2 years. The Portland law firm had filed its injunction and lost, but losing a first filing did not mean the party behind it had accepted the outcome. A second attorney contacted Alcott in February, this one representing a collector based in Tokyo whose agents, according to Elias's letter, had been making inquiries about the collection since 2015. The Tokyo collector's claim was not a legal claim, precisely, but a formal expression of interest backed by a letter asserting that Elias had, in a private conversation some years earlier, promised certain pieces to his client's collection. Alcott handled this with the calm of someone who had seen variations of this argument before. He asked for documentation of the alleged promise. None materialized. He pointed to the will, to Clause 11, to the activated legal transfer, to the 180 pages of Marta Jansen's authenticated documentation. The collector's attorney went quiet after the second exchange of correspondence and did not reappear. The Swiss attorney named in Elias's letter contacted Alcott directly in March. His name was Bernard Hess, and he was, he said, the attorney of record for the Zurich Foundation, named as the residuary beneficiary of the Vance estate. He was not contesting the collection's transfer to Clara. He wanted to understand the timeline for the broader estate's resolution so his client could plan accordingly. This was a reasonable inquiry. Alcott handled it with transparency. The Zurich Foundation, it turned out, had been established by Elias himself in 1978, funded by the profits of his earlier work, and had been quietly supporting arts education programs in several countries for 45 years. The organization's executive director sent Clara a brief letter in April, in French, which Walter translated. It said that the foundation was grateful for the orderly handling of the estate and that they hoped the collection would eventually find a public home. It said nothing about the money, which suggested to Clara that the foundation was not primarily about the money, which was the correct conclusion to draw about an organization that had been doing its work quietly for 45 years without anyone noticing. The art world's response to the discovery was more sustained and more various than the general public's. Marta received letters from 14 institutions in the first 2 months after the authentication report was filed, including 3 major museums in Europe that had been, over many decades, trying to locate specific pieces they believed might have entered private collections after various disruptions in the 20th century. 3 of those pieces were in Elias's documentation. 2 of them, Marta found, had been purchased by Elias directly from the institutions he'd traced them to, legally and at fair value, as part of the process of establishing clear ownership. The 3rd had a more complex history that the ongoing investigation would clarify. 2 scholars of antiquities contacted Walter directly, asking to study the provenance documentation Elias had built. He forwarded their inquiries to Alcott, who forwarded them to Clara, who said yes to both because she understood, from reading Elias's letter carefully, that the documentation was designed to be used. He hadn't built it so it could sit in a box. He'd built it so the world could know what it knew. The auction house came in May. Not to rush anything. but to begin the conversation about how to bring a collection of this significance to market in a way that honored both its value and its history. The representative was a woman named Caroline Ashby, Senior Vice President for Private Collections at one of the three major houses, and she arrived at the Ashworth Grand with the particular quality of composure that comes from spending a career around significant objects and having learned that expressing too much emotion about them was professionally inadvisable. She spent 2 hours reviewing the authentication documentation in the hotel's small conference room, which Clara had finished and furnished in February, and which now served as the operational center for the various legal and logistical processes the collection had generated. Then she looked at Clara directly and said, "This is the most complete provenance documentation I have seen, attached to a private collection in 20 years. He spent 30 years doing exactly what needed to be done." "I know," Clara said. "What would you like to see happen with it?" Clara had thought about this for months, in different configurations, at different hours. She'd talked about it with Alcott and with Walter and with Marta, and she'd arrived at an answer that she was fairly certain was right, which was the same level of certainty she'd arrived at when she raised her hand at the county auction. "Some of it should go to public institutions," she said. "The pieces with the clearest museum significance." Elias noted 3 specific pieces in his letter that he'd originally intended for institutional placement once the provenance was fully established. Those should go where he intended. And the rest? She thought about the Zurich Foundation, 45 years of quiet work. She thought about the county library's archive, which she'd funded in February, which was now in the process of digitizing materials that had been inaccessible for decades. She thought about Sophie Reyes and the community college's hotel management program that had sent her. The rest goes to auction, with the proceeds partially reinvested in what Elias spent his career doing, making sure things end up where they belong. Caroline Ashby made a note. Then she looked up. "What about the hotel itself?" "The hotel is not for sale." A brief, professional smile. "That's what I thought." The restoration continued through the summer, Howard and his crew working floor by floor with the patient precision of people who understood they were working on something worth taking time with. Clara spent a portion of each day walking the floors, checking the work, asking questions, learning from the answers. Walter was there 3 days a week, his notebook filling with observations about original materials and architectural decisions, and the specific history of how the building had been built and why certain choices had been made at particular moments. She learned things about the Ashworth Grand from Walter that she hadn't known even as a child who'd spent years inside it. She learned that the pressed tin ceiling in the lobby had been ordered from a manufacturer in Cleveland and had taken 4 months to arrive by rail in 1941, and that the original owner had paid considerably more than the market price for it, because he wanted the specific pattern that the manufacturer's catalog showed, and the manufacturer had discontinued it the year before, and it had taken a special order and a premium to get what he wanted. She learned that the ballroom's sprung maple floor had been laid by a craftsman from Portland who had also laid the floors in 3 other ballrooms in Oregon that were still standing, and that 2 of them were considered historic landmarks. She learned these things, and she took notes, and she added them to the history of the building the way her mother had added to it by showing up every day, not because the notes were important in themselves, but because the act of paying attention was important, because the building deserved to be known. Leo found a book about Oregon architectural history in the library and brought it home with the specific urgency of someone who has discovered something they want someone else to see immediately. He'd found a photograph of the Ashworth Grand from 1953, a formal exterior shot taken for a regional business directory, and the building looked almost exactly as it looked now from the front, the renovation work having returned the exterior to something close to what it had been. He put the book on the kitchen table and set the photograph next to it and looked at Clara until she compared them. "We got it right," he said. "We got it close," she said. "That's what we can do. We can get it close." He considered this. Then, is close good enough? She thought about Elias's documentation, 89 clean provenances out of 112 pieces, the remaining 23 being handled with full disclosure rather than concealment. She thought about the 6 pieces that required more investigation before they could be moved. She thought about 30 years of patient work that was excellent, but not complete, because completion in that field was a direction rather than a destination. "Close is what honest work looks like," she said. "You do it as well as you can, and you disclose what you don't know, and you keep working. That's close." Leo looked at the photograph for another moment. Then he took the book back to his room, presumably to find more photographs, which was what he'd been doing for 2 months. She received one more letter she hadn't expected, in April, forwarded through Alcott from the care facility where Elias had spent his last 8 months. It had been in storage with his personal effects since his death, mailed to the facility from an address she didn't recognize, apparently having arrived after he died without being opened. The return address was in Geneva. The handwriting on the envelope was shaky but legible. Elias, the Ashworth, Kellerton. The letter inside was in French, which Walter translated. It was from a woman named Marguerite Fontaine, a dealer Elias had worked with in Paris in the 1970s, writing to say that a particular painting she'd always believed he'd been right about had finally been verified and was being donated to a museum in Lyon in his name, or in the name he'd been using then, which was the name on the provenance documentation he'd provided 40 years earlier. She said she hoped he was well. She said she hoped he'd built what he'd always said he was going to build. She said she was glad the right things ended up in the right places when they could. The letter was dated 6 weeks before Elias died. He'd never read it. Clara had Walter write a response on her behalf, in French, explaining what had happened and where the collection was going. She asked him to convey that Elias had indeed built what he'd always said he was going to build, and that it had ended up in the right hands. She didn't know if that was exactly true, but it was what she chose to believe, and she thought, on balance, that he would have accepted it. Leo turned 9 in October, which was also the month the Ashworth Grand's first-floor restaurant reopened to the public for the first time in 4 years. Not the full hotel, not yet, but the restaurant. The dining room with its original wainscoting and its built-in server's station, the kitchen brought back to working condition and staffed by a chef who had spent 10 years at a restaurant in Portland and wanted, she told Clara at the interview, to work somewhere that had history in the walls rather than design work on the walls, by which she meant something that had earned its character over time rather than purchased it recently. The first dinner service was a Thursday, 38 covers, every seat filled by people from Kellerton who had been following the hotel's story since the spring and who arrived with the specific anticipation of people who had grown up knowing a place and were seeing it return to what they remembered. Clara worked the floor herself that night, not because she had to but because she wanted to. She moved between tables the way she'd watched her mother move through corridors, with the specific quality of attention that made people feel cared for without requiring them to perform gratitude for it. She didn't introduce herself as the owner. She introduced herself as Clara, and when people asked if she was the one who'd found the collection, she said yes, and when they wanted to talk about it, she talked about it briefly and honestly, and when they wanted to talk about the food or the room or their memories of the hotel, she was happy to talk about those things instead. At the end of the night, after the last table had gone and the kitchen crew was doing their closing work, she sat at the bar with a glass of water and looked at the dining room in the after-service quiet. The wainscoting, the server's station with its shallow drawers, the light fixtures that were the originals, cleaned and rewired, throwing the same warm quality of light they'd thrown for 80 years. Sophie sat down beside her. She was learning every part of the operation simultaneously, the way you learn something you actually intend to do with your life. How does it feel? Sophie asked. Like it's supposed to be here, Clara said. They sat in the quiet dining room for a while, not saying much. The way you can sit with someone when the work of the day is done and the room is doing what it was built to do. Outside, Kellerton went about its Thursday evening. The county library had its lights on, the archive in the basement being digitized by a volunteer working late. The Historical Society's 2 rooms were dark. The county court building was closed. The building that had once been a travel agency, across the street, was in the process of becoming something else. Inside the Ashworth Grand, the chandelier hung in the dark lobby, its 47 crystal drops still and quiet, holding the shape of the light they'd catch in the morning when the east-facing windows let in the first of whatever the day would bring. The hotel stood the way it had always stood, through its prime and its sale and its renovation that never finished, and its foreclosure and its 4 years of vacancy, and the auction where nobody wanted it except a woman who couldn't explain exactly why she needed to bid on it at 1 in the morning with her dead mother's savings, holding everything that was placed inside it with the specific faithfulness of something built without any expiration date in mind. It had held 30 years of a man's careful work and 36 years of a woman's daily care, and a 7-year-old girl's serious eyes, and a key in a carved fish's tail, and a note that said when rather than if, and a collection worth $382 million, and now it held a restaurant, and a family, and a restoration, and the sound of a 9-year-old discovering acoustics in the lobby, and the smell of proper food coming from a proper kitchen, and the particular quality of attention that a building only develops when the people inside it understand that care is not a lesser form of work. It held everything, the way it always had. It was built to. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.